Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, fresh off helping to provoke race riots in Belfast, Elon Musk has become the world's first trillionaire. Slightly frustrating sequence of events. We'll talk about the economics of the SpaceX IPO and the politics of Elon Musk, further extending his wealth to quite grotesque proportions. And we'll also be bringing you the breaking news from the sentencing hearing of the Palestine Action activists. The judge has already indicated they are going to be sentenced on terrorism charges, so we'll see what those amount to. Also, when is a riot not a riot? Well, apparently, when it's featured on GB News, we show you a remarkable scene from that channel over this week. And we speak to a tech CEO who let Grok run free with disastrous results. We've got a great show lined up for you today with a great co-host. I'm joined by Banseka, Kayembe. Great to have you on the show again.
We're back.
Yeah, a brilliant welcome back to the country to have you here. That's what I came back for.
I thought so.
If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com, of course. Don't forget the /support. You can also listen to the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And don't forget to let us know what you think in the comments below. Elon Musk might seem like a moron on Twitter, but his stratospheric business success still shows little sign of slowing down.
At the NASDAQ in Times Square, at Starbase, it's SpaceX celebrating its record-breaking IPO, a $75 billion offering priced at $135.
So those were the scenes today at SpaceX HQ, as Elon Musk's rocket company has begun trading publicly on the stock market for the first time. So that means that 25 years after the company's founding, members of the public can buy shares in the company. This also means that they have to make more of their accounts public. The demand for those newly released shares has been incredibly strong. So in last night's IPO, initial applicants were able to get their hands on stock in the company for $135 per share. So that was the price set by SpaceX. And there was lots of demand for it. They sold all the stocks they wanted to sell. That gave the company a valuation of $1.7 trillion. It's been the top 10 most valuable companies in the world. It was only today, though, that SpaceX stock was traded publicly, which means anyone can buy or sell it in the open market. Robinhood app, I think, is how a viewer of this could buy SpaceX shares, although we're not encouraging you to. And the interview we're going to have is actually, I suppose, would push you in the opposite direction if we were giving trading advice, which we're not. The price on the open market, though, has already gone up to $160 per share, giving SpaceX an implied value of over $2 trillion. So it's phenomenal amounts of money. This would make Elon Musk personally the world's first trillionaire. So he has now become the world's first trillionaire, on paper at least, and he seems pleased.
Yeah, it is certainly hard to believe that a little company that started in a warehouse in El Segundo is now going public with the largest IPO that ever. And let me tell you, if people had told me this was going to happen, I was like, man, you must be smoking some really good crack, because I think this company's going to fail.
Now, some people do still think the company might fail. Not everyone is convinced that current investors in SpaceX aren't suffering from some kind of delusion. Background, SpaceX, of course, is most famous for its rocket business, which makes money principally through fulfilling contracts for NASA, so deliveries to the International Space Station and the like. Since 2019, though, it's launched a network of satellites called Starlink, which provides internet to 12 million customers. That might not sound much, but it sort of includes militaries in war zones like Ukraine, and the company is completely dominant in that sector. Now, these are cutting-edge, successful parts of the business. However, SpaceX is still yet to make a profit, and its revenue of $18 billion is a tiny fraction of its $1.7 trillion valuation. So $18 billion per year is their current revenue, but it's valued at $1.7 trillion. Now, that is not normal to have such a big gap between those two figures. So this chart from the FT shows companies' market valuation as a proportion of their annual revenue. So at the bottom there, you can see companies like Amazon, Meta, Apple, and Alphabet. The overall value of each of these companies is between 3 and 11 times its annual revenue. So that seems, more of a reasonable amount to pay for a company. SpaceX, though, at the top, its value is 92 times larger than its current annual revenue. Now, that means the company needs incredibly rapid growth to justify its valuation. If it continues making the amount it's making now, no one's going to make back their money, right? So they need extraordinary growth, even though it's quite an old company. And SpaceX is claiming this will come from a division where the company isn't dominant. So it's dominant in rockets, dominant in satellites, but it's not dominant in artificial intelligence. However, an investor prospectus raised eyebrows by claiming XAI, so that's the AI part of the company, which includes Grok. They say that could be expected to increase its revenue by 100-fold, so by 100 times between now and 2030. So it's already 2026. It's got to increase by 100-fold in 4 years. That would be from $3 billion today to $330 billion in 4 years' time. So it's very ambitious, very optimistic. Not everyone's convinced. And someone who isn't is Matt Scherer. So he's a research fellow at the Open Markets Institute, a US-based think tank. I spoke to Matt earlier today, very interesting guy, and asked what he made of SpaceX's valuation.
Well, speaking just for myself, and I will say that I do not own shares in SpaceX, nor do am I betting against them. So this is just my personal analysis. No, I do not think it is worth that much money. I don't think that it is worth anywhere close to $1.75 trillion. If you read the company's prospectus, which is the key document kind of describing its business plans and what it plans to do after it goes public, SpaceX is saying that it thinks that its future as a company, the market that it is going to try to win over, is not what it has built itself on historically. Historically, SpaceX has been a rocketry company, and more recently, it launched the Starlink satellite internet service. Those are both, relatively successful businesses. SpaceX's rocketry has had some challenges, but it has been growing in importance as part of the space exploration industry. Starlink has been a very successful product. One that has presented lots of challenges on its own, including for astronomers who are having apparently increasing difficulty getting good views of some celestial bodies as a result of these satellites kind of cluttering up the atmosphere. But the business model behind it appears to be in good shape. But the thing that the prospectus says that SpaceX is leaning into is building AI infrastructure, and particularly building data centers in space. And data centers in space are never going to happen. If anybody does try to build data centers in space, they will lose gargantuan amounts of money because the cost of launching the equipment into space and what is necessary to, kind of keep the components of a data center cool in space, it's just prohibitively expensive. And if you take away kind of that market, if you look at its prospectus, that is 90% of the market that SpaceX thinks that it's going to be competing in, is this AI infrastructure market. So no, it's hard to see how the company will actually be able to return $1.57 trillion worth of value to investors.
The argument for, just so sort of our audience is clear, and maybe I'm going to get this wrong, but the argument for sort of data centers in space is that the sun is always shining, so they can run 24 hours a day. You've said they need to be cooled out there, but I thought space was already quite cool. But so I'll come back to you on that. And then you're saying it's going to be too expensive to service it because sending rockets into space is already quite expensive. But I suppose Musk would respond that he's already, reduced the cost of sending rockets to space by a factor of 100, and he can do it again. So I suppose, why are you quite so confident that this business model of having data centers running in space couldn't work?
So couple of things. One, if you want a more fulsome explanation of this, Adam Becker, who is a physicist that wrote a book called More Everything Forever, that takes a close look at Elon Musk's kind of business models and plans on a higher level. He actually has done a great analysis. If you Google it, you can find it explaining all of the physics difficulties of doing a data center in space. You are correct that it is very cold in space. But the problem is that the chips and server racks that fill them in data centers produce heat of their own, and that heat needs to go somewhere. And it's not simply the case where like it automatically evaporates away, or that you can use, gravity powered hydraulic systems to move water around and cool it like you can on Earth. So the equipment needed to radiate the heat out of these space-based data centers. I can't remember the exact statistic, but for a data center that is relatively modest in size, you would need like a square kilometer worth of radiation equipment, in order to get rid of the heat that it generates. And that's just one of the challenges, the cost of actually like launching the equipment into space. Reducing the amount of the cost of getting things into space by 100-fold is the hope and the promise of the Starship system. But as news coverage of the Starship test launches shows, they have had quite a bit of trouble actually making the launch system viable and reliable. Even if you take them at their word, I believe that they said that they would have a 98% success rate with launches. But that still means that 2% of the equipment that you launch is going to fail and get lost. And that is actually a pretty significant amount given the enormous cost and expense associated with building data centers, even on Earth, much less in space.
Most of the people investing in SpaceX today are not going to be experts on whether or not we can have data centers in space. What they'll be doing is they'll be looking at Elon Musk as an individual and saying, in 2002, this electric company went public, Tesla, of course, and there are all these naysayers saying this could never work. The batteries are too expensive, it'll be too heavy, no one will buy it. And then there were some people who sort of said, no, actually, it's a brilliant idea. And when it comes to that gamble, Elon Musk was proved right. So I was looking up today, if you bought Tesla stocks in their IPO in 2002, if you bought £10,000 worth of stocks or $10,000 worth of stocks on the day of its IPO, it would be worth more than $2.62 million this year. So there'll be people thinking, God, I wish I got in on that IPO the last time Elon Musk had a company go public. So this is a guy who we can believe in. I want in this time around. Why do you believe that would be sort of faulty logic?
Well, to be sure, Elon Musk is one of the greatest company promoters, to use what is a historical term for a person who starts companies and promotes them, in history. He is great at advertising and creating a vision for the future of a company. And one thing that investors are, I don't want to say suckers for, but they are very enamored by is a compelling story. And the story that he told with electric vehicles, I will give him full credit that he saw that was a future market that would explode in popularity as pressures from climate change and from instability in oil supplies kind of became ever more important in the economy. He jumped in and established a relatively dominant position by being forward thinking about that. But just because somebody has one or two or three great ideas does not mean that all of their ideas will be great ideas. And it's not that Elon Musk hasn't built great businesses in the past, but this is a business in which he is going in facing already very fierce competition. If what you're talking about is developing AI models, building AI data centers, that is a sector in which he does not have some sort of first mover advantage. You've got Grok, the chatbot that XAI, which was purchased by SpaceX earlier this year, merged into SpaceX. It has fallen far down in the number of downloads that it's gotten recently. SpaceX is building massive data centers, and they certainly are going to be able to, turn a profit off of that. But there's a lot of other companies that are building data centers as well. So it's not as though that's something that's unique. And the idea that they are in a position to put data centers in space, that is kind of the unique secret thing, the first mover advantage that SpaceX offers over other companies that are involved in the same business lines as SpaceX. And that is why it's kind of important that, again, if you if you look at analysis of it from physicists, it's just not a plausible idea. It's something that sounds good only until you understand and read up on the actual physics and engineering of how constructing and cooling such a data center would actually work.
And let's say you're right. So let's say that this was a big mistake and investors have massively overvalued SpaceX, and it's not going to have the future revenues that it's claiming in its prospectus it will have. Does this matter to anyone other than sort of the people who in the past 24 hours have bunged a load of money on SpaceX shares? Should we care beyond sort of saying, ha, you guys, you've all made a big mistake?
Unfortunately, yes, it's going to matter. It's going to matter to all of us. And the reason why is that the vast majority of stock is not held by people buying and trading shares in individual companies anymore. It is through index funds and mutual funds. And those, particularly in this case, what is most important is that Musk decided to list SpaceX's shares on NASDAQ. And NASDAQ changed the listing rules for its NASDAQ 100 index so that SpaceX will become a part of that index in a matter of days. Usually it takes several months. And the reason that's important is that there are a lot of index funds that are by operation of the way that they work, they have to buy a certain number of shares of any company that is listed in the NASDAQ 100. I believe the last time I looked, there was, I want to say about $700 billion worth of index funds that are tied just to the NASDAQ 100. And if SpaceX, which looks like it is going to have a market cap approaching $2 trillion by the time it gets listed on the index fund, that means that a lot of investors are going to essentially be forced to buy shares of SpaceX, whether they want to or not. So once that happens, a lot of workers, a lot of retirees, a lot of insurance companies, a lot of pension funds, they will be heavily exposed to SpaceX and will be exposed to any losses that they sustain from their data center business.
That was Matt Scherer from the Open Markets Institute. Banseka, I'm not sure if you have any sort of strong opinions on the viability of data centers in space. So I thought we would sort of take on a different aspect of this story, which is the politics of, any person becoming a trillionaire, which, seems on the face of it incredibly obscene, but then also the person who has become the first trillionaire being the same guy who is a very politically engaged far-right activist, essentially. Like, what are we to make of that? How do you draw a connection between this guy who's just become the world's richest guy on the basis of his businesses, who also on the side has a sort of his main sort of day-to-day obsession stoking racial tension throughout the world?
We could say that's just a coincidence that he happens to be both of those things, but I don't think so. I think one probably feeds into the other. He's clearly got some kind of an interest. I mean, it's interesting because his sort of business mindset, and he was kind of known as this first principles guy, right? Someone who thought in terms of first principles, which is where you reject sort of industry orthodoxy and you break through industry assumptions, which is a good thing to have, by the way. It's a very useful thing to operate in. I don't think that any of the kind of heterodox thinking that he's displayed through his entrepreneurship, like, can he not apply some of that to his politics?
Well, he would say he is being heterodox. It's just because he's clearly sort of going against establishment ideas of what is like an acceptable thing to say or do.
He's taking establishment ideas.
Like he's bringing back kind of really intense racial politics, like from apartheid South Africa, which would have been rejected in the West for a very long time.
He's taking establishment ideas and he's bringing them to their logical, most extreme conclusion. Is probably what I would say, as opposed to
I don't quite agree with
he's
that.
not anti-establishment, is he? How's that
Well,
heterodox?
I think he's definitely expressing an opinion which has been outside of the norm in liberal Western societies for decades, in like the major parties, in the major media establishment. He's really going back to kind of like proper old school racism on his Twitter, which is like race war.
Does that make him heterodox?
Yeah, but being heterodox isn't necessarily good, right? That's what I don't think. Tucker Carlson is heterodox, but he's still chatting a lot of shit that's quite dangerous, and I think the same with Elon Musk. But anyway, that's a bit of a distraction potentially.
Sure. I mean, as his fortune grows, I think so does the incentives, I think, for him to engage more and more in these kind of extreme ideological positions, right? On social media, he's been very, very involved, I would say, in what we've had this week, talking about, he says, retweeting things like Keir Starmer hates white people. It's quite an extreme thing to say, really. It doesn't really bear out with the truth. He's repeating these restore mantras, millions must go. That's the one I keep seeing. And there's quite a coordinated effort to get that out as a kind of catchy slogan, which it is. It's very clear about what it means, and it draws a very clear line between maybe the more civic nationalism that Reform were playing with, and it draws a very clear line between that and what is very clearly and specifically ethnic nationalism, which Reform are now clearly quite worried about. So he's playing very much in that arena, and I don't think it's a coincidence that as his wealth solidifies and concentrates, so does his commitment to a kind of ever more far-right, very deeply racist politics. I don't think that's a coincidence at all. And I think lots of people across the right are worried about that. Kemi Badenoch was on LBC, I think, this week talking about how politicians, they're too afraid to say that we have alien cultures here who are, sort of infecting our British culture. But I would say the reverse is true. I think there are politicians who are far too afraid to say, actually, what we've seen on our streets are acts of racism. I've had very few people actually across the political spectrum come out and say that. Hilary Benn is someone who I can think of from the cabinet who said it, but not many other cabinet ministers appear to have joined him so candidly in saying that. We can see across the right, Kemi Badenoch included, restore, reform. None of these people want to say what it is, which is that this is a form of white grievance, really, that is being whipped up, being manufactured, and in the absence of facts, because I think it's worth remembering with this particular incident in Belfast that Elon Musk has been really involved in, there's so many facts we don't know. We really only know the bare minimum about, this perpetrator's ethnicity. We know a little bit, I think, about the victim and some of the victim's sort of sad circumstances that he's been through. But there's lots of other information we don't know. And that's not a justification, of course, for his behaviour, which is despicable. It's extremely worrying from a public safety point of view that anybody's going to go out and behead somebody. That's terrifying. But there's so many things we don't know. And in the vacuum of that lack of knowledge, the far right, Elon Musk, they come out to play. And now we've got people, I think, who really are believing that there is two-tier justice against white people in this country. I think that is an increasingly, that's an idea that does seem to have a bit more traction. I'm not saying everyone believes it, or the majority, but I do think it's something I'm seeing more and more and people engaging with more and more. So Elon Musk, his wealth increases, so does his propensity, it seems, towards far-right politics. And that's a concern, and for me, another justification for why we absolutely should not have certainly billionaires and certainly not trillionaires.
Yeah, if I keep looking at my laptop, it's not because I'm getting distracted from your point, it's because I'm waiting for the Palestine Action sentences to come in, which they haven't yet. I didn't even notice. But until that happens, let's continue talking about Elon Musk. Yeah. I suppose, because there are two ways of looking at it. I suppose I see the connection between his far-right politics and his being a trillionaire as almost the connection being the other way around, in the sense that one of the reasons, beyond it just being sort of like a social justice atrocity to have someone quite so rich when there are still poor people. I think the big problem with having someone as rich as that is that they then get completely outsized influence over politics, and the fact that they're good at business doesn't necessarily mean that they're like reasonable, rational people when it comes to politics, which I think is very much the case with Elon Musk. I don't really buy into the argument that sort of like the logical conclusion of getting super rich is becoming an ethno-nationalist, because we've just had so many rich people before who haven't been ethno-nationalists. You know, like Bill Gates was for a very long time the richest man in the world, and whatever you think about him, I mean, he definitely didn't make it his sort of life's work to try and stoke racial division. Like, sort of, he gave up his company and spent quite a lot of time saving quite a lot of lives with malaria nets and the like. I'm not an expert on Bill Gates, but I think there is an element of Elon Musk's business acumen and wealth and his far-right politics, which is somewhat coincidental. And that's partly why his influence is so dangerous, because we haven't really seen this for quite a while. You know, I mean, like Henry Ford was an anti-Semite, wasn't he? But I don't know if he was sort of pushing it to the same extent that
It's
Elon
difficult
Musk
to
now
compare,
is.
isn't it? Because of course they've got completely different modes of communication. A part of me does feel like if Henry Ford had Twitter,
Maybe if he had
or owned
Twitter, yeah.
we maybe would have had an awful lot more from the guy, and he would have been on kind of Elon Musk's level. But I don't know, we could compare him to like some Mark Zuckerberg or maybe
But Mark Zuckerberg's not particularly politically motivated. So that I suppose what I'm getting at is, it seems what's uniquely dangerous about Elon Musk, I don't think he is just any old other rich guy. You know, like, it's just like, oh, if anyone who would to have got that rich would have ended up being like a far-right ethno-nationalist. It's just the logical conclusion of getting rich. I think that there's something quite like unique and sort of almost an accident of history that in this very dangerous moment already, social media, mass migration, far-right politics is already quite tense. We also happened to get the world's richest man who comes from apartheid South Africa and wants to bring back like real old school race war.
Yeah.
It seems to me like a really, really unlucky accident. That doesn't make it any less bad.
a series of unfortunate
Do you know,
events.
like a real series of terribly unfortunate events.
I'm sure his background in growing up in South Africa will have had an influence. And we know his dad, you know, has said copious amounts of things that I think are seriously beyond the pale, right? So I have heard that apparently your parents are still your biggest influencer in terms of what politics you're likely to have, apparently. So the family that he comes from, which I think is very steeped in, as you say, that kind of old school racial apartheid of South Africa may have an influence. But I don't know, the likes of sort of Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, I know they're not out there in the same way that Elon Musk is in making very, very contentious remarks.
Well, there's no evidence
I know
that nationalists, really, is there? There's no evidence that Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos are like white supremacists, but there's a lot of evidence that Elon Musk is.
Yeah, but then to what you can still argue that Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos, they still benefit hugely, of course, from like that landscape, right? Even if they're not coming out and saying it because they don't need to, or they don't feel like that's what's going to serve them best. Like, these are still people who've ultimately made huge amounts of their money in part off the backs of, you know, racism and racial capitalism, for example. Yeah,
what they used to do is donate. I mean, they would generally, Silicon Valley donated to the Democratic Party like 90%.
Right.
Like, I don't think that they did really see their wealth as reliant on ethno-nationalism. Like, I think they, like the ideology of lots of these companies was like, well, let's bring the world together. We want our markets to be as big as possible.
That's shifted in the past.
Yeah, but that hasn't shifted really. That's shifted from the politics. So it's shifted from a sort of guy potentially of like world historical significance for all the wrong reasons. Elon Musk coming forward and Donald Trump coming forward, and they're not anti-racist stalwarts. Like, the moment the wind has changed direction, they're perfectly happy to go along with it. Like, I'm not trying to excuse them here, but it seems to me that there is a kind of independent historical force that's come from people like Musk and Donald Trump.
Musk was like that at one point, though. I'm pretty sure we were seeing him fall along the lines of sort of vague liberal identity politics epithets and things like that. He hasn't always been like this.
The Democrats, and something radicalized him along the way.
So don't get me wrong, I'm sure there are individual markers about Elon Musk who, generally speaking, I have to say, seems like quite an odd guy. But I do think that a huge factor here still has to be wealth.
The racist pogroms that took place in Belfast this week was shocking. What we witnessed in Northern Ireland was racists burning down the homes of people they believed to be migrants or they believed to be just non-white. Lives were put at risk, livelihoods were destroyed. Now, in response, some politicians on the far right have been reluctant to condemn this violent racism. More bizarrely, some high-profile journalists have denied it even happened.
To suggest that these skirmishes that we've seen in Belfast tonight, because they weren't riots. There weren't riots. There weren't people marauding through the streets with pitchforks.
There was a house set on fire, Beverly. There was a house set on fire. We've seen numerous pictures of fires ablaze in Belfast. This is disgraceful, violent behaviour that is not going to get anyone anywhere. It's going to further terrify communities who are already traumatised by the horrific images that were shown around the world from last night.
And what you have just done is precisely the rage baiting that I am trying to do the opposite of.
What are you talking about?
You are saying, but people's houses are burned down. This is awful, this is awful. I'm saying, actually, it isn't that dramatic. There aren't people, there aren't bodies piled up in hospital
Someone's
tonight,
house
Matthew.
being burnt down in a riot is not that dramatic. What are you saying, Bev? What words are you allowing out of your mouth?
There was no riot. There was no riot.
There was no riot.
There is not a house that has been burnt down.
There was no riot. There is not a house that has been burned down. That was Beverly Turner, host at GB News, claiming that the pogroms in Belfast, I suppose, did not in fact happen. And she said very explicitly no houses were burned down. Now, you know some were. We're just going to show you some footage anyway, just to remind you. All of this is footage from Tuesday evening. So before she was speaking there, multiple houses set on fire, multiple families, including one with a 2-month-old baby, being forced to flee their homes. This footage was all available at the time of Turner's broadcast. Indeed, much of it had already been shown on her channel. Let's look at the rest of that extraordinary exchange.
Did you or did you not see the image of a house on fire? We've seen in Belfast.
Yes, but I've seen.
That's not that dramatic. It's pretty dramatic to me.
Your definition. That is, when you use phrases like far right and riots,
Beth, we're going round in circles.
That is not what that is. But
what do you think it is? When a house gets burned down and you had your reporter on the ground who you spoke to at the beginning of this show talking about multiple fires in Belfast caused by civil disorder.
That's right.
You're not calling that a riot? What do you want to call it? What do you want to call it?
No, I'm not calling it a riot.
What do you want to call it then?
I'm not calling it a riot.
What are you calling it?
Because there aren't people in hospital tonight because of what's gone on there. There aren't people in hospital. And I think you are precisely the problem in that you are whipping up the hatred. You are exaggerating. You are exaggerating what's happened on the streets of Belfast tonight. You have the temerity to call me the problem
when I'm calling out violence in Belfast.
My show. I'm talking. I am saying that the commentators that come on the TV like you say, this is outrageous. These were riots tonight. There weren't riots tonight, Matthew. There's a few teenagers who have set alight vehicles and it has been a busy night for the police, and I am not diminishing the reaction, but don't try to whip up the British public into thinking that there is civil war on the streets tonight and people are out with their pitchforks.
That's outrageous, Beverly. I've never said there's civil war. That's an outrageous allegation. I've never said that. You're floundering around for accusations because you are unprepared to properly call out. Sorry. You are unprepared to call out outrageous behaviour on the streets of Belfast. Put me on a single shot, please.
We need to move on. Put me on a single shot, please. Get this guy off the screen because, I mean, in this case, he's just so obviously right. And then resorting to saying, you're saying there's a civil war in this country. Now, that was Mathew Stadlen, by the way, the commentator who was a guest on GB News. The one channel in the UK with the most journalists who talk about there being a civil war happening is GB News, right? That's why they refer to migrants as fighting age men. It's to constantly get in people's this idea that there's about to be this kind of race war. Those are sort of the parts of, I mean, there are lots of parts of GB News I find very offensive, but it is that sort of, that constantly stoking this civil war narrative that I find most dangerous, most damaging, most disgusting, and the idea that that's what Mathew Stadlen, the guest, was doing is completely bizarre. Not bizarre, outrageous. Beverly Turner there also said it was a difficult night for the police. So sort of like that's who really suffered here. No one else. You know, it was just boys, just teenagers setting fire to cars. Tough for the police, but let's not get carried away. Well, let's have a look at just one example of first-hand testimony from people who were affected by those riots, those pogroms. This is local resident Jamie Corrie.
I was literally standing right there watching my whole house just go up slowly but surely, and that was it. There's literally nothing I could have done about it. I told them and all when they were lighting the car on fire, that's my property where our car is, and they still didn't care. They were like, oh, it'll be safe. I knew straight away it wasn't going to be safe. The car was literally like that, parked on the side of the footpath.
Obviously, I mean, there's been so much testimony this week especially people of colour, people from migrant backgrounds being just completely terrified in Belfast and elsewhere. Lots of houses burnt down. Banseka, what was Beverly Turner thinking there?
I don't think she was thinking at all. Just a kind of.
I gave you the opportunity for that one, didn't I?
Thank you very much for setting me up for that one. Yeah, her brain just sort of vacated momentarily there. I don't know. I mean, we are so kind of far down the lens in the terrain of lies, mistruths, half-truths, taking small fragments of information and then blowing them up out of proportion very, very quickly. That perhaps she's just so in the kind of the vein of that and the sync of that now it's just, well, actually that thing that you saw didn't happen. Like that's where we are now. And I laughed when I saw the clip, of course, because it's so absurd. There's an absurdity to it. But of course, within the absurdity, there's something seriously dangerous there. I think about the collusion between politicians, reform and restore agitating, particularly on the right, and GB News. And GB News in many ways kind of are reform, that the two are quite interchangeable, right?
I mean, literally their presenters are reform politicians. It is reform TV.
They are symbiotic bodies, right? One and the same, two limbs on the same body almost. So, that relationship between all of these composites is really hammering, I think, our ability to be able to think clearly. And I don't know if you found this as well, but even I'm finding it very difficult to think clearly at times with this barrage of information and this barrage of misinformation and the parameters of the conversation being so much about ethnicity. I think your colleague Ash Sarkar said, like, we're now just primarily viewing crime through the lens of race, which can't be healthy. Even if you do think that there's a hint of two-tier injustice against white people in this country, for example, even if you think that can't be healthy and that can't be normal for us to be viewing it kind of solely through this lens.
So the pushback, obviously, this is separate from the appalling clip of Beverly Turner and the appalling riots, just completely indefensible. The argument that is made on the right or the centre, or even just some sort of unorthodox people on the left, is to say, well, this obsession with race, like the left sort of are not in a great position to sort of complain about it, because it was the case that whenever there was an arrest or police violence or whatever, it was always immediately about race if the person was black.
Yeah.
And so the argument is that Black Lives Matter and that movement, some of its excesses sort of made everything so much about race that now the right are doing it. It's harder to sort of sound like an honest broker when you say, actually, maybe it's more complicated.
Yeah. And I understand why some people might say that. Two things I would add to that. One is that when it comes to, obviously, disparities in how Black and ethnic minority people are treated by the police, that is backed up by significant amounts of data. With what we're talking about with the horrible case of Henry Novak, for example, or this awful case. We don't know much about this awful case of the beheading, to be fair. There's still lots of evidence to come out yet about that. But we're getting these kind of individual sporadic cases that are then being built to build a case that this entire system is rigged against you. So the data's just not really quite there. If you want to make a point about perhaps the sort of liberal identity politics infection into how the left built its case around racism, I think we can do that. I think one of the jarring things about some of this conversation is actually, hey, there were people on the left who did sound the alarm about certain ways of framing things, which didn't include talking about racial liberation in a way that's also about white people. That was what I wrote this week, and I was thinking to myself, one of the things I was thinking, amongst obviously feeling terrible for the people who are the primary targets of this violence that we're now seeing, is that this is fundamentally illiberating for white people. There's not going to be a liberation for white people as a result of these this way of thinking and this obsession with whipping up white grievance. It's a tool for people in power. It's for people like Nigel Farage to ascend to the highest levels in office so he can keep getting his crypto money or whatever. But it's not going to liberate your average white British person. Your liberation lies in my liberation and vice versa. The safety of Henry Novak, a white boy who was, mistreated by the police. Ultimately, I think that's a key reason as to why he dies, is the police do not treat him with the care that anybody who's, been stabbed deserves. That is also a reflection of the ways in which, of course, lots of black and brown people have been treated and mistreated by the police as well. So our safety and security is bound up together. That's an argument that I think the left has to make, and has to make very clearly and very strongly. And I do think whilst there are liberal identity inflections in how we talked about race and racism or crime on the left, I do think there have always been left-wing people who've been making that case.
Is it too... because I think it's always a bit easy for people on the left to say, actually, the problem was just the Liberals. Because I suppose an argument that's been made, again, this is a million miles from what Beverly Turner said. This is a million miles from sort of the Belfast riots, which is just appalling. No one needs to complicate that, right? Yep. That's just out and out racism and terrible journalism as much as anything else. But in the case of this argument that sort of the left didn't necessarily behave with as much responsibility as they should have done to now sort of be in a very strong position to say, why are you making everything about race? So say an example with Henry Novak, there are people sort of on the right saying the police did get some documentation saying they shouldn't treat everyone the same because you're trying to sort of correct disparities because you're assuming that any kind of disparity is because of discrimination and therefore you have to do some kind of positive discrimination. We shouldn't be colorblind. And their argument is they've come along and they've seen Henry Novak and they've thought, okay, well, this is an issue about racism. We have to take the racism bit really seriously. And then people saying, well, there's not actually enough evidence to really suggest that it was a race issue. They kind of thought the guy was drunk. That's the best explanation. So something that makes you think a bit about is the Chris Cabot case, where he's a guy who gets shot. Obviously, tragic case, but immediately everyone on the left says it's because he's black. This is white supremacy. This is racism. The trial happens. It turns out he had been involved in a shooting earlier in the week. The police had good reason to think whoever was driving that car had a gun. And then he did sort of ram a bunch of police cars. So to me, it doesn't seem like that case really was about race. Might be tragic, might be that the police did something wrong. But the best explanation for that, for me, isn't the race one. But there was a period on the left where everything, sort of the left weren't willing to sort of say, well, maybe it shouldn't be viewed through a racial lens. Maybe this is just a lens of crime and a difficult policing situation. I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, I can't remember enough about the specific details of the Chris Cabot case because I don't want to talk too much, I suppose, about the specificities of how much that was driven by race or not. Obviously, a lot of the time, as I said, there is a lot of data that supports that we live in a policing system which does over-criminalise lots of different groups of people. Actually, I think working class people in general are over-criminalised, for example, as well. But we have a policing system that is reflected in the data. Black children are something like 8 times more likely to be strip searched, for example. So when an incident like Child Q, if you remember, comes up with the little black girl, 15-year-old black girl was strip searched by the police when she's on her period, people get angry about that very quickly because it reflects a disparity that I suppose is well worn in a very long period of time of discrimination. If we want to make the point to say we should view things with a more complex lens, maybe the grooming gang scandal is a good example of that, where we can say there might be multiple things at play. I would push back very heavily on some of the arguments that the right have made about saying there was this DEI policy paper and that, meant that the police suddenly magically had a totally different culture that now was actually really pro-black and really pro, minorities to the detriment, pardon me, of white people. I think anyone who's ever worked in a soulless corporate job knows that just because something's written down on a DEI policy paper, which is often a kind of box-ticking exercise I'm sure many of us will be familiar with, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's reflective of the culture of the organisation itself. And I will also add, finally, again, there were conversations on the left about diversity, equity and inclusion, diversity initiatives that were ultimately, for many of us, hollow. For me, racial liberation isn't about a bunch of diversity inclusions in the kind of corporate sphere. It's about redistribution of wealth, safety and security, all these things that will liberate all of us, including all white people as well. So again, there has been, I think, a well-worn discussion amongst anti-racist campaigners about making sure that we do not allow racism and anti-racism, to become the domain of kind of corporate solutions. but that we have a material understanding of racism that actually speaks to how people materially live, so we can ensure that people live materially better. And there's always been that critique of those kind of DEI initiatives on the left as well. We have to be very careful about how we make them. I don't want to create ground for the right to start saying, this is DEI gone mad. I don't want to do that. But we do also have to be very honest about the ways in which these corporate, elite captured sort of ideas about race were just useless as well.
Yeah, we could talk about this a lot. I think the sort of the return of colorblindness, I think, is interesting, because I think maybe it was a mistake to go away from it. But we'll have to have this discussion another time. 4 Palestine Action activists have been sentenced at Woolwich Crown Court today. Leona Eli Cameo, Charlotte Lottie Head, and Fatima Zainab Rajwani were all convicted of criminal damage in May for destroying property at Elbit Systems Research Centre near Bristol in 2024. Cameo and Head were each sentenced to 6 years in custody. Wow. Rajwani to 5 years and 8 months. So those sentences just in 6 years and 5 years and 8 months. Samuel Corner is the 4th person sentenced. So he was convicted of criminal damage at that same trial earlier this year, also of grievous bodily harm, though without intent. That was for fracturing one of the vertebrae of an attending policewoman. Now, he's been sentenced to 8 years and 8 months in prison. Those are really long sentences. If you think the sentences for criminal damage seem long, that's because they are. Now, as Novara's Simon Childs reported from court today, the judge decided the activists would be sentenced as terrorists, despite never having been charged with a terror offence, a terror crime. That's because he found a terror connection in the action. So Simon, my colleague, reports this in his Novara Media piece. Justice Jeremy Johnson told the Woolwich Crown Court that he found that defendants were well aware of the aims and strategy of Palestine Action, and that the raid was aimed at shutting down Elbit and ending what they regarded as British complicity in Israeli war crimes, and to intimidate it into ceasing operations or cause the government to prevent it from operating. The destruction of military assets was one part of a broader and more strategic purpose to shut down Elbit and put pressure on the government, he said. He cited the destruction to things which could not be described as weapons, including the smashing of a disabled toilet and the spraying of paint on the walls. I am bound by the legislation to find that the offence in each case has a terrorism connection, he said. Remarkable. We were watching some of the sentences or some of the sentencing statements while we were playing one of the previous interviews. And the judge kept sort of talking about how it was very clear that these people were intending to influence government policy and therefore it's terrorism. Now, I just thought that was what civil disobedience was, trying to influence government policy. And then he's saying it's terrorism because they weren't just going for weapons, they also damaged a disabled toilet. Now, my definition of terrorism, and I don't think many people in the street, is damaging a disabled toilet. Anyway, moving on. Previously, Justice Johnson had held that the terror connection was partly based on the activists trying to influence the Israeli government. In the courtroom today, Johnson went back on that, saying it wasn't the Israeli government they were trying to influence, but the British one, aiming to pressure it to shut Elbit down in the UK. The terror connection means that the sentences are longer and that they're only eligible for parole much later. So that's very significant, actually. When I was reading out, those sentences, I was like, but they'll probably only serve half, right? That's how this works. But no, it sounds like the terror element means that might not be the case. Multiple human rights groups, legal professionals and politicians have spoken against the use of terror law in protest cases. And today, Amnesty International's UK chief said this: criminal damage has never been treated as terrorism within the UK justice system before, and it is completely disproportionate to do so because the offence occurred at a protest. A terrorism sentence carries restrictions that stay with a person for the rest of their life. We should all be worried about what this means for other individuals taking direct action in protest at a genocide or any other issue. After all, the right to protest is one of the most effective tools we have to hold our leaders to account. The use of terrorism laws to suppress direct action protesters sets a dangerous precedent for our fundamental rights in this country and must come to an end. Now, one thing that had been missing during the criminal trials was a list of the equipment damaged by the activists at the Elbit site. Elbit, as a reminder, is Israel's largest weapons manufacturer. Its biggest customer is the Israeli military. Now, according to the activists, they broke into the Filton facility to break up weapons and systems that could be used in Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza. That was not something the judge allowed them to talk about to the jury. So they were barred from dwelling on their motivations for the attack in their evidence. The judge said that we shouldn't talk politics in this. No inventory of the smashed equipment was given to the jury either, even though the value of the goods destroyed was over £1 million. That list, though, of what they did destroy, so what they were actually targeting, did appear in today's sentencing hearings. This is the first time we've seen this. It appears to confirm that the Elbit site was, in fact, developing weapons, most likely for the Israeli military. That was an Elbit advert for its Bird of Prey series of killing machines, an example of the kinds of autonomous drone made by the firm. Many similar drones were amongst the destroyed equipment at the site, with the barrister for Leona cameo making reference to the names of several models in open court. So they included autonomous 4 drones designed for use in frontline combat and used in Gaza for strikes and reconnaissance, according to the Jerusalem Post. And they also included in the damage were Elbit's Magni X drones, described on the firm's website as, quote, developed to provide the Israel Defense Forces with the most advanced close-range observation system. It is, the website brags, specially designed for the urban arena, providing day and night intelligence. Now, other destroyed drones were sentient Kestrel AI targeting systems. Sentient Kestrels, strange. They were used, that's the name of them, I suppose. They're not actually sentient, but sentient Kestrel AI targeting systems used to guide missiles to what are often human targets. Now, in total, 40 significant military assets were destroyed alongside lab equipment and computer systems. Banseka, I mean, many things to talk about. So sort of the details of the particular drones that were sort of revealed today. Obviously, a suspicion that the reason the prosecution didn't provide that to the jury is because they didn't really want the jury to have in the forefront of their mind that these guys were damaging military equipment, which was going sort of to a place where tens of thousands of women and children and innocent men were being killed. Obviously, the jury also didn't know that they were convicted people of terrorism offences. The jury just were asked to make a decision: were these people guilty of criminal damage? The judge has come in afterwards, and they've now been upgraded to terror charges. And because they did criminal damage and tried to influence the government, suddenly they're terrorists in prison for, 4 to 8 years. Crazy.
I'm not comfortable with that slippage. I don't know how you feel, but it feels...
Well, between criminal damage and terrorism?
Yeah. And for a jury to be a de facto, maybe in the black and white letter of the law they're not, but de facto they have unknowingly sentenced them to terrorism charges, right? I'm not particularly comfortable with that particular slippage in the law. You've already made the point around civil disobedience. The raison d'etre of civil disobedience is, of course, to change policy. That's pretty much what it's meant to do. It's normally used as a way to protest and change laws that groups of people feel are unjust. And so this feels like a very, very uncomfortable overlap between where I think we should have something quite clear and distinct. You've kind of got 3 tiers here, right? You've got kind of what you might call lawful protest. Maybe that's going outside on a protest, for example. You've got civil disobedience, which, yes, may encroach into the realm of criminal damage. I don't think anyone is disagreeing, probably, that they have engaged in criminal damage, and they probably knowingly engaged in criminal damage. They know what they were doing, but they believed that they were doing it for just reasons. And frankly, I would agree with them looking at the nature of those machines, those killing machines. And then you've got this third tier of terrorism charges. And I'm very uncomfortable with the way in which we seem to be collapsing these 3 together more and more, I have to say. It also worries me as well that, I do feel like with this slippage between the two, it also has an impact on policing as well, and how police may see these types of prospective groups that are engaging in civil disobedience. They may also see that as a reason to engage in things like more surveillance tactics, for example, through a kind of counter-terrorism lens. Perhaps they're going to exercise things like stop and search powers more restrictions on assemblies, monitoring of organisers. So whilst I don't wish to be hyperbolic and say no one's going to be able to protest from now, of course not, but it does feel like these slippages between what I think should from a democracy point of view, be quite separate categories, are kind of melding together a little bit more. And what does that say, I suppose, about where our democracy is heading and the confidence of people to go out and protest against things that they believe are unjust? The other thing as well, which me and you were talking about earlier on, is that there's an odd juxtaposition between this case and what we've seen the outcomes of in Belfast, where we've had people rioting, engaging in racist rioting, targeting of ordinary members of the public because they are black or brown, because they're perceived to be migrants, different, not from here. Those people have been sentenced, I think, quite quickly, but they've been sentenced under the criminal realm, right? They're not sentenced under terrorism, although from what we've described, you could potentially, if we're going to say that this is potentially terrorism, then why not the rioters in Belfast? They're rioting for very specific political reasons. They're endangering, clearly members of the public, setting someone's house on fire, as Beverly denied on GB News, setting someone's house on fire. You're endangering people, in the public for very explicitly political reasons. So this conversation about two-tier justice, we can have a deeper conversation about some of the disparities in our criminal justice system, of which there are many, but this two-tier justice system, which the right likes to talk about as though somehow right-coded causes are, treated far more draconianly, whereas left-wing causes are given kind of carte blanche to run, that doesn't seem to be the case. And this particular incident today, these juxtaposition of these two things seems to really exemplify that their perspective on two-tier justice is not really true.
Well, and I suppose the common thread is that, and this is explicit in the law, is that when things are associated with political disorder, that's an aggravating factor. So people are always like, why did this guy go to prison for 2 years for a tweet? It's because it's associated with political disorder, and that's an aggravating factor. This is just more than an aggravating factor, though, because this is like a terrorism connection. I'm just going to, because this is all breaking news, I want to be careful that I'm sort of giving you the precise correct information. I'm not that steeped in legalese. So I'm just getting some sort of clarifications and updates from my colleague, Stephen, who says, be careful calling these terror charges because they're criminal charges with the terror connection and aggravating factor. Okay. So they haven't been convicted of terrorism charges. Mm-hmm. They've been convicted of criminal charges, and then the judge has sort of decided that a terrorism connection was an aggravating factor. Just to remind you of the length of their various sentences. So for Cameo and Head, 6 years each. That's criminal damage with this, terrorism connection. For Rajwani, 5 years, 8 months. And then for Corner, 8 years and 8 months. That's for criminal damage. And then the grievous bodily harm served consecutively. And then I've asked Stephen about when they'd be eligible for parole. So sort of what's the sort of minimum sentence they'll serve. And Stephen has informed me almost 5 years before parole for the three women and 7 years, 8 months for Corner. So that's an extraordinarily long sentence. I'm supposed to go back to the issue of sort of how criminal damage with intent to influence government policy has suddenly become terrorism. Because I'm fairly moderate social democrat now, but I used to be more of an anarchist when I was younger. And I broke into Stansted runway and stopped a bunch of planes taking off, against airport expansion. It was like my climate activism days. And clearly that was quite extreme criminal damage, very explicitly to affect government policy. Now, I got community service for that.
Right.
Because, and we thought we were just going to get a fine. Got 50 hours community service. Because it was called aggravated trespass at the time, which, it was aggravated. It was trespass when you're trying to stop someone doing their legally, the thing that they have a legal right to do. I was never out, I wasn't like, how dare you arrest me for this? I knew I was committing a crime.
Yeah.
And I knew that I was going to serve some kind of sentence for it. And I was fine with that. But if they'd sort of, and presumably that's what these Palestine Action people were sort of expecting.
I think so.
If they'd slapped on a terrorism charge to me for that could have ruined my whole life.
Yeah.
It probably would have ruined my whole life.
Yeah.
Right? So the fact that sort of after the fact, what by most people's understanding is criminal damage to affect a political outcome, or, in one case, grievous bodily harm, which I don't, I'm not outraged that these people got found guilty of this, right? If it would have been fantastic if the jury could have been told the full information and they could have been told sort of the political motivations, and then maybe like we have seen in previous cases with the Colston statue, for example, the jury do acquit the defendants because they're like, we can kind of see what you did was on the face of it illegal, but we think you were stopping a bigger crime. Like, I think the jury should have been told that. But if the jury had then decided, well, we've taken all this into account, but we still think it's criminal damage, come on, I would have not been that outraged. I think the people taking part in it would have expected that. But for this terror charge, which just doesn't ring true, like I think you ask anyone in the street, what's terrorism? And they say, oh, it's smashing up a disabled toilet when you want to change government policy. That's not terrorism, that's criminal damage.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the fact that you want to change government policy has never really been considered an aggravating factor.
It's very, very strange. I mean, I don't know enough about it. I probably shouldn't confess. I do have a law degree.
I warned that I was going to bring that up, and you told me not to.
I graduated 10 years ago, guys. So, and unfortunately, I don't have a lot of expertise around sort of terrorism charges and things like criminal damage. But it does seem I'm quite baffled, actually, and maybe you have a better insight than me, as to why they are not... Is it at the judge's discretion for them not to tell the jury about particular facts of the case? Is that discretionary on the judge's behalf?
So again, I shouldn't say this either, but I'm not like a legal expert. Stephen's the one who's very good at all of this stuff. But my understanding is that basically after lots of the Extinction Rebellion stuff, and the Just Stop Oil stuff, and the Insulate Britain, the blocking the cars stuff, basically the government wanted to get much tougher on this stuff, and they wanted sort of judges, prosecutors, and juries to be more harsh about it. And that meant that they got, and especially the Colston people getting sort of not found not guilty. They got much more strict in terms of getting judges to say what is admissible and what's not admissible. We don't want them to give their political justification. You have to be clear to the jury that all they're judging on is the legal facts of the matter without any politics involved. And then the judge gets to decide what's admissible and what's inadmissible. And deciding what's admissible and inadmissible is normal in a court. So often, if you're tried for, one crime, shoplifting or grievous bodily harm or whatever, the judge won't allow the prosecution to tell the jury that you've also committed a few crimes in the past, because they say then that will prejudge their outcome. So having admissible and inadmissible things is perfectly reasonable for a judge to say, but clearly there's been a political decision to say, we want to throw the book at these people. And the terrorism charge is a new thing beyond obviously what Extinction Rebellion faced. Yeah. And that's where Israel comes in, right? It's that there's a foreign policy establishment. We know the government seems to be very willing to break precedent when it comes to Israel, and that's what seems to have happened here.
Yeah.
Apparently, Stephen's telling me, as they left the dock, Charlotte Head shouted, "In order to hear the birds, the warplanes must be silent." So obviously, these people who are now going to prison for a very long time, unsurprisingly, still very much believe in the rightness of what they did.
I mean, it's interesting because when you study law, like one of the first principles you learn in sort of criminal law is like mens rea, which is intent and intention. What was the intention? And it's normally to try and draw a line between, I suppose, did this person actually intend to do X, Y, and Z? Intent is the kind of key factor that you normally have to establish, quote unquote, beyond reasonable doubt in our legal system. And so it strikes me as quite odd to kind of revert against that way of thinking in our legal system, which we have a long legal precedent for, to say that key aspects of intention are now just not relevant if they're to do with politics. That, to me, instinctively doesn't feel right, doesn't feel correct. It feels like it's missing a crucial piece of context that I think potentially a jury might feel quite guilty about having not had access to. I can't imagine being on that jury, realising afterwards and being like, oh God, and now I've de facto sent these people down for
a really long time.
For a really long time as well. That doesn't feel like a particularly healthy aspect to our judiciary. And I'm worried about the ways in which individual judges may be able to, have a lot of discretion about how they interpret what they will or won't keep in a court case that's relevant for juries.
We got a little bit more to this story, actually. There were large protests outside Woolwich Crown Court today as the sentencing hearing was underway inside. So hundreds of demonstrators turned up to support the Filton 4. waving flags, banging drums, and calling for justice. And 72 people were arrested under the Terror Act for holding up signs reading, "I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action," as part of that silent vigil. Okay, so that's also happened today, so that's significant. Now, that sentence, you'll have heard it before, "I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action." That's apparently prescribed under the Terror Act following the banning of Palestine Action as a terror group by Home Secretary Yvette Cooper last year. Now, in a judicial review, Palestine Action co-founder Huda Amouri successfully argued that the ban was unlawful, with the court agreeing with her. Nonetheless, the ban remains in force while the government appeals that decision. So even though a court has decided it was unlawful, you still can't hold up that banner without getting arrested until the appeal is heard. Now, the result of that will be published on Monday. So we'll obviously be reporting on that on Monday. One of those arrested for holding up a bit of paper told reporters what he made of it all.
Anything to say, friend? Anything to say?
What, how ridiculous. Yeah, how ridiculous.
Another image of like a really lovely older person that we've seen so many times getting arrested for holding up a bit of paper saying that they oppose genocide and they support a group which commits civil disobedience to try and stop a genocide. Banseka, we're going to wrap up very soon. I suppose the question I wanted to ask you is not so much a legal one, even though you've got your legal degree, but I do feel like neither of us feel like we can speak with quite enough authority when it comes to the judicial process. I want to talk about the politics of this, which is there's going to be a new prime minister soon, quite possibly going to be Andy Burnham. Do you think he is going to sort of continue with Labour's sort of very authoritarian course when it comes to Palestine Action? Because he could become prime minister and say, "Oh, the whole prescribing Palestine Action, that was a mistake." Obviously, whether or not it might be that the courts decide that actually it was lawful. It might be that they decide it's unlawful. But if the courts decide it's unlawful, then the government is free to go away and come back with a new case for it. To say, okay, maybe we didn't do the process properly, but here's a new case. We still want to prescribe it. Or the government can say, okay, we give up now. It's legal. What do you think Andy Burnham will do if he becomes prime minister?
Yeah, I don't think we've had any indication whatsoever that Andy Burnham will be particularly divergent from the current status quo of the Labour Party on these particular issues. I think when it comes to immigration, law and order, foreign policy, particularly foreign policy around Palestine and Israel, Andy Burnham seems to fall largely into line. The things that he's been more divergent on, I think, have been a bit more to do with economics, wealth redistribution, those types of things. Although you could make an argument and say Keir Starmer's done some of that stuff. He's not been entirely right-wing on everything the whole time necessarily. So I don't think we've had any evidence that Andy Burnham is going to be particularly divergent on these issues. I know his background with links to, supporting the Iraq War and things like that has left a bad taste, perhaps rightfully so, in people's mouths. And I do just think ideologically, this concept of Manchesterism gets bandied about quite a lot. Suddenly the Westminster Commentariat is an expert in Manchesterism, quote unquote, whatever that is. I don't think I know really. And there's a good case to say some local journalists who've done some interesting work around Andy Burnham over the last several years have said it doesn't really amount to a lot. It's a bit vibes-based. It's a bit of a feeling. It's a bit of an anti-Westminster vibe, anti-Westminster feeling. But when you get down to some of the specifics, it's not really a lot at all. Andy Burnham strikes me as a politician who's capable of capturing perhaps a certain mood, a certain understanding of people emotionally, perhaps somewhat intuitively, which Keir Starmer admittedly doesn't have. I don't think he has that. But I do not think when it comes down to the nuts and bolts of things, when it comes down to the specifics, when it comes down to who he's facing, not just externally outside of the Labour Party, but internally within the party, is he really going to have like the chutzpah to take those kind of establishment kind of takes on and dismantle them? I don't think so. He's talking about having Josh Simons in his team.
So I'll put forward the case for why there might be a change.
Go on.
But I'm not exactly predicting it. And I'm going to be very clear. It's not because Andy Burnham is like an incredibly principled, brave person who's really willing to sort of incur political costs for the liberation of the Palestinians. I don't think there's much in his political career that really suggests that's in his nature.
No.
The argument why I think there might be a pivot is because Andy Burnham has to do something to show that he's different from Keir Starmer and to appeal to left-wing voters. Now, I don't think he will shift on immigration because I think that's too costly electorally among voters who are reform curious. I think there's a limit to what he's going to be able to do economically because of the bond markets. So I do think that one thing he can sort of demonstrate a significant shift to the left on without really upsetting any voters, because voters don't like Israel, and without upsetting the bond markets, because bond markets don't care about Israel, is shifting the government's position on Palestine. So I do think that there is a pragmatic, almost cynical reason why Andy Burnham might have a big shift on Palestine, because it's a cost-free, both electorally and financially, way to indicate to the left, who are green curious or already gone to the Greens, that you are different from the man who came before, who they all hate.
Yeah, and I think Novara posted some data. I think your colleague Harriet Williamson posted some data that Gaza was like the number one issue for people leaving the Labour Party as well.
100%. You can tell that by meeting people in the street, right? There's so many people who've gone to the Greens because they just think it's despicable how Labour have dealt with this.
I'm wondering on a practical sense how he shores up a basis for that. Because one of the other things about him coming into power is that if it happens, he'll have a cabinet presumably still stuffed with people who have been quite, complicit in the current status quo, the current position on Israel. How does he get those people on board? How does he shore up their support? Does he replace them? In which case, replace them with who? Because it feels like the broader Labour Party, despite having so many MPs, it feels quite dearth for talent, really. So that's tricky there. I'm wondering how he shores up that support within his cabinet, because the thing is, you can't just go in there as a single individual and be amazing, right? Like, it'd be great if you could, because it'd make things a lot easier.
And also, he's not going to be that anyway.
No, he's not going to be that guy anyway, by the way.
Let's wrap up there, Banseka. It's been brilliant spending another evening with you.
Thank you very
much. Very good show. We covered a lot. Thank you guys for watching. We will be back on Monday for another live stream from 6 p.m. We also have a very long live stream planned next week for the by-election of the century. As ever, if you want more special shows, more super long live streams, the best way to do that is to help us sort of build our resources by going to novaramedia.com/support. We really appreciate how many of you have come forward and added your support over the past month. If any more of you would like to join the movement, go to novaramedia.com/support. For now, have a great weekend. You've been watching Novara Media. Good night.